Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well despite recent events. So I just watched the end of an era, that is Game of Thrones Season 8, the finale. Let's talk about it. So this is going to be my review of Game of Thrones Season 8 in general, and I will be discussing spoilers here. Obviously, we're going to get into some of my favorite parts, some of my least favorite parts about this season, but overall, Game of Thrones is just one of those shows. In fact, it's the only show where I looked forward to this every single year, and I knew that no matter what happened in the show, the quality was just going to be out of this world. And I was so looking forward to the finale, just like millions of other people. And so my expectations were so high, about as high as they were for Endgame, to be honest. And I have to say that overall, this season did not meet my expectations, and honestly, just in general, it disappointed me. So first of all, I'm going to be discussing the characters, and number one has to be King Bran. This is something that I never expected to happen. As the scene unfolded with everyone there, all of the lords and the ladies, and Tyrion is making the speech about how powerful stories are what really count when you're looking for a leader, which is completely incorrect, by the way, but that's beside the point. He's making this speech despite the fact that he has been silenced by Grey Worm several times. As he continued to speak, I suspected that he would perhaps point to Sansa or Arya or anyone else. But then he points to Bran, and it felt like some kind of joke. Like I felt like I was in a surreal reality where he would slap his thigh and it was like, haha, just kidding. And everyone would kind of laugh it off and continue on with the discussion. But no, they landed on Bran. Everyone said even though it made absolutely no sense. And that to me is the biggest issue of this ending, is that it did not make sense in the context of the story that they had been telling for the last 8 seasons. Now, perhaps Bran plays a bigger role in the books, and that is completely fine. I would have just preferred if they had separated the ending of the books and the TV series, because it doesn't make sense in this context. Bran has done absolutely nothing. He's done absolutely nothing. The one role that he had to play in this whole story was related to the Night King. During that sequence in Winterfell, he had nothing to contribute really. All he did was send a bunch of ravens out to spy, and that was about it. Now, this isn't to say that I don't understand the reasoning behind it. I do. I understand the fact that he's the three-eyed raven, and so as a result, he isn't human like the other potential leaders were. He isn't able to be corrupted the way that the others were, the way that Dany was. And I have to say, to that point, it seems like there's a possibility that he has been playing the long game the entire time, because whilst he can't see the precise future, he can see possibilities that could be the future. He still must have known that ultimately, if certain events played out the way that they did, then he would end up on the throne. Does that not make him selfish then and dishonest that he didn't relay this piece of information, this very important piece of information, knowing that many thousands of men were going into battle and dying when ultimately he would become king? Does that not make him just as power hungry as the rest of them, potentially? The fact that no one raises this, the fact that no one questions this is, again, just outrageous. And this is kind of played off as a joke when he says, you know, what do you think I'm doing here? Why do you think I came all this way? But it's not a comedic moment. It's a moment of just sheer horror, because it makes absolutely no sense. And he shows more emotion in that one line than he has throughout the entire, I don't know, 6 seasons at least. It's just a shambles. So for me, this ending with Bran becoming king, it was shocking, and not for the right reasons whatsoever. Speaking of the Dragon Queen herself, this episode we finally saw the demise of Daenerys, and surprise, surprise, I have problems with this as well. I personally did not love the way that Daenerys became the Mad Queen. Now, I actually like the idea of her ultimately becoming the Mad Queen. I think it makes sense because the madness runs inside of her blood, although that's not really how mental health works, but whatever. I feel like there was a potential for there to be a lead up to this, and it would have been very satisfying to see her ultimately come to that position. But it wasn't played out that way. It was very very rushed. And ultimately, Benioff and Weiss were forced to telegraph the fact that she was going to become the Mad Queen, rather than embedding it cleverly into the story, into the narrative, the way that they have done with other themes and other character arcs in previous seasons. I feel like they really flopped on this one, to be frank, because whilst we knew it was coming, and some of us suspected that it had been coming from seasons before, I still felt like she as a character deserved so much better, so much greater care in the way that they developed this story arc. It was rushed. Ultimately, she was very emotionless during this season, and in a lot of the previous season as well. Her relationship with Jon Snow wasn't really nurtured in order to make us believe that it was genuine, it was coming from a deep place. The best example of that relationship was actually shown in this episode just before she died, but I would have loved to see more of that because it felt more real than it ever had before. It was very clear that the writers wanted us to distance ourselves from Daenerys and no longer see her as our Khaleesi, so that when the moment came when Jon slayed her, we would feel that he was justified in his actions and we would feel more sympathetic towards him than towards her. And it was all, again, very clearly telegraphed that it wasn't even a satisfying ending at that point. We saw it coming from a mile away, and after the bells, the previous episode, we knew there was only one path that Daenerys could really go down. And again, I didn't have an issue with the Mad Queen angle. It's just the fact that we never saw a slow turn into the twisted nature that she has inside of her, and we never really saw it develop slowly but surely the way that the earlier seasons would have done, because they did such an amazing job establishing her as this freer of slaves, this liberator, and yet now all of a sudden she's fine with burning down children and women and innocent civilians, and it makes absolutely no sense. Yes, she has always burnt down the cities that she wanted to protect, but she has always had consideration for the innocents as well. That was her entire purpose. We never saw that slow descent into madness. It was very rushed, telegraphed to us directly, and not very convincing as a result. Next up, we have Jon Snow, and here I'm just annoyed. I'm just genuinely frustrated because as I was watching Game of Thrones, I've been watching it for many years now, since 2013, and every single year I would watch it, I would pretty much skip a lot of the Jon Snow parts. The Bran parts and the Jon Snow parts just weren't my favorite. I didn't care about those characters at all. It was only in the later seasons when I realized that, oh, he was going to become a significant character and his bloodline was important and his parentage and etc, etc. So I started sticking along for the ride. And so the fact that Benioff and Weiss made me sit there and actually watch Jon Snow's character arc develop and actually make me like him ultimately, only for him to just be practically useless in the end, reverted back to where he came from. It's so frustrating because I understand the logic here, right? I understand that their reasoning was, we are going to subvert expectations. Everyone's going to think that Jon Snow is the one, the ultimate prophecy ruler, etc, etc. Like, he is the one that's going to end up on the throne because it makes sense, because of his parentage, because of his legacy, because of all the wars that he's fought, and he's proven himself as a warrior and a leader. But ultimately, he's not going to end up there. He's just going to end up back where he came from, in the Night's Watch, which, by the way, what's the purpose of the Night's Watch when the Night King has already been defeated and the wildlings are now allies? I do not know. But anywho, so I understand the decision that they made on that front, but I still disagree with it because whilst I didn't want Jon to end up on the throne, I think that would have been way too tidy and neat bowish, and that's not something that you want from a show like Game of Thrones. The fact that he, first of all, his lineage never came up during that whole speech that Tyrion made about who would be the best ruler according to their story. He didn't even come up. He didn't even come up in the conversation. He was just exiled as the Queenslayer, but his lineage is a huge deal, and the fact that it wasn't even a deciding factor in who to choose as the next ruler was absolutely outrageous to me. And I thought it would have even made sense because in the previous episodes, Bronn had even mentioned that the person who does the most killing, who wreaks the most havoc, is ultimately the one who ends up on the throne. That would have been a great symmetry to actually have Jon, despite the fact that he did kill Daenerys, still end up on the throne because ultimately his parentage and his his lineage does matter in this case. I would have found that to be okay, because ultimately he had to pay the price. He did have to kill Daenerys, but he would have ended up on the throne, not because he's this perfect divine ruler, but because the system is rigged. The system rewards people who have killed and maimed and done horrible things and puts them in places of power. I thought that would have been a very interesting twist on Jon Snow's ascension to the throne if he did end up there. Or even if he didn't, just the fact that his lineage is a huge factor in that decision-making process, and it wasn't even mentioned at all by Tyrion, who made such a huge deal out of it earlier on in this season. I think it was just such an oversight. But still, I was really happy to see his reunion with Ghost. It really broke my heart to see Ghost's missing ear. Just the idea of him being cruelly hurt during that battle, it sits unwell with me. But just in terms of seeing Ghost and having that bow tied at the end there was really nice. Now on to Tyrion. I've actually been saying since episode 4 that I thought he should have died instead of Melisandre. During episode 4, when the boats are attacked and everyone is going into chaos under the water, you see him, the camera hones in on him during that sequence, and I really thought that that would be the character who would suffer the most out of that whole traumatic experience. I thought he would have been kidnapped by his sister, and in the end there, when he's making his big speech about Cersei being a mother and not wanting to hurt other people and think of the child, it would have been so much more impactful if he had been the one whose life was at stake. I feel like Melisandre's death, while sad, did not have the emotional impact that Benioff and Weiss thought that it would. And I think having Tyrion there in her place, Tyrion who's just been kidnapped by his sister, who is unrelenting and willing to do whatever it takes in order to keep the throne, including killing her hated brother, I feel like that would have been so much more impactful than what we ended up getting. And so when he's pleading to Cersei about having mercy, it would have had so much more meaning, and ultimately she would have killed him anyway. Dany would have seen that this woman is so beyond reason that she's willing to kill her brother, that the only way to get through to Cersei would be to burn it all down. I think that would have made much more sense, especially considering that in that same episode, Tyrion was shown to be such a loyal follower of Dany. During that episode, he's speaking with Varys, and Varys is talking about treason and betraying Dany, and Tyrion is standing by her side even when she's not present and defending her. And I feel like that would have really hit the nail on the head in terms of the betrayals that Dany was facing and the losses that she's facing. I feel like this would have been the hard-hitting death that would have brought Game of Thrones back to its glory days, and it would have made sense. It wouldn't have just come out of nowhere just to have a death for the sake of it. It would have made sense because he was Dany's most loyal advisor, even if he did make mistakes. Jorah had tried to convince her to give him another chance, and so he was ready to take her up on that chance, and yet he still ended up dying. And so as a result, she feels like she is alone, especially considering that at this point Varys is still alive and yet he's planning to betray her. That would have just emphasized that point. That would have been where Tyrion would have died, and it would have made so much more of an impact. But instead, he gets rewarded. He gets rewarded for continually having been an idiot these past few seasons, and he gets made Hand of the King. Now, you could argue that there is some poetic justice in the fact that two of the most powerful men in the Six Kingdoms have disabilities, and they were traditionally looked down upon by society. That's an interesting take on things. However, Tyrion even explicitly says that he has made mistake after mistake after mistake, and the justification given of making him the Hand is that he's going to have to fix those mistakes in the position of power and wealth that he's in. That is ridiculous to me. I think this is where it just lost me, to be honest, and it became so transparent that they just wanted to wrap up the story in any way possible. And so yeah, just make Tyrion the Hand, even though he has not earned it at all these last few seasons, and the worst thing that Dany ever did was ever trusting him. Having said that, Peter Dinklage did give a very good performance in this last episode, especially when he's miraculously able to find Cersei and Jaime, and he's crying over their dead bodies as both of his siblings have died in each other's arms. And that was really sad, even though it highlighted that they could have just moved to the side of it and avoided all of the the bricks falling down on their heads. But that's beside the point. The point is that it was a really sad moment, and whilst there were some inconsistencies and things that didn't really make sense and leaps in logic, it had an emotional impact. And I think Peter Dinklage's performance was just great, as it always is. But the fact that the show hasn't really given him much to do for the past few seasons kind of undercuts his ending. We kind of forgot what it was like to have a truly powerful and witty and intelligent Tyrion on the show. He's been making mistake after mistake, and it's really had a negative impact on his character. So I, at the end, wasn't truly invested in his character, and I wasn't convinced by the ending at all. When it comes to Arya, I actually loved her during this season. I thought she was amazing. I wasn't perturbed by the fact that she ended up killing the Night King. Whilst it was a bit Deus Ex Arya, it did have a huge impact on me, because all of those training sequences and the faceless men and all of that came to fruition in the end. And while she didn't specifically use the techniques that she may have learnt from there, it just created this character, this mythological character almost, that was capable of doing such a thing. And so when it happened, it was sick and I loved it. Arya has stayed pretty consistent. It's not the case that she hasn't changed, because if you think of the child that we started off with in season 1 and we look at this young woman that she is in season 8, and by the end of season 8 off to explore the new world and catch diseases, I feel like that character growth works so much better than some of the others, because it was incremental and it built up to it so satisfyingly. And to see that the person that she is today is a combination of the faceless assassin and the daughter of Ned and Catelyn Stark, I feel like that was a very well developed character arc. And so in the moments where she is resolving her issues with the Hound or starting a fling with Gendry, I actually really liked that, although it was very awkward for me. And during that sex scene, I promptly went to go get a drink of water, because it's kind of like Arya's everyone's little sister, so it was kind of awkward. But it just made sense. Her character arc makes sense here. It was very satisfying to watch unfold, and where she ended up is true to her character, because she has travelled all throughout Westeros at this point, and so of course she would want to see what's beyond. The only things that I will say do not quite make sense is, firstly, that prophecy about her closing brown eyes, blue eyes and green eyes, that never really came to fruition. And that's not really the only prophecy that never came to fruition, but that's just something notable there. Secondly, that whole thing with the white horse at the very end of last episode, that doesn't really make sense to me now in light of what happened in the last episode. And thirdly, the fact that she easily gave up on her vendetta against Cersei, whilst it kind of made sense because the Hound was saying, you know, look at what vengeance, look at what the lust for revenge does to you, in that very moment where she was in the Red Keep about to get her vengeance. I think that was a nice moment, but ultimately this is something that has been stewing on her mind for years and years. I think if they really wanted to convince us that Arya had turned the other cheek, they wouldn't have had her kill a bunch of people beforehand, and they would have done it at a much more convincing pace, because ultimately the first half of the season glorifies how effective she is at killing people, so much so that she's able to kill the Night King. So the idea of her just kind of throwing her hands up and saying, yeah, I don't want to kill the Queen anymore, that was a bit bizarre to me. I thought it was leading to Arya at least killing Daenerys, the new Queen, but not even. It was just really weird how they kind of ended up doing that. Those are the only issues that I had with the character of Arya. I think she actually left the show pretty unscathed, so at least there's that. In terms of Sansa, I like that she ended up Queen of the North. A lot of people wanted her to end up on the throne. I kind of did and didn't. I didn't because ultimately her story arc is one of suffering and a lot of pain. And she's shown herself to be an adequate ruler in the North. But the show made it very clear that she was devoted to the North and devoted to the Stark family legacy. So it made more sense to me that she would end up Queen of the North. The fact that she was able to just nudge her brother and be like, hey, Bran, can you make us a separate state, please? Because we just want to rule ourselves and we don't want anything to do with the other 6 kingdoms. And the fact that he allowed it to happen made absolutely no sense to me. That was just mind-blowing because, yeah, it was a win for Sansa, but that was so unrealistic. There is no way that Bran could make the first declaration during his rule getting rid of an entire kingdom, one of the 7 kingdoms. That is crazy. And the fact that he did it for his sister as well, like that would have caused outrage amongst the lords. They would have started an entire war. Everyone would have been wanting separation at that point. So that was really bizarre to me. They wanted to give Sansa a win, and they gave it to her very heavy-handedly, but it didn't really make any logical sense, because everyone would be wanting to, I mean, this is literally Brexit. This is Brexit. The EU happened to be run by, I don't know, Theresa May's sister, and Theresa May's sister was like, hey, you can leave and everyone else has to stick around. Like, everyone would be livid. There would be a war. There would be something. That just... it made no sense. But I guess they just wanted Sansa to win. I know that the showrunners have an affection towards Sansa. Some of the characters they prefer to others, and she's definitely a favourite amongst them. So they definitely carried her arc very well. They gave her a nice little ending, and it was very fitting, to be fair, because she had shown herself to be a powerful ruler, and very consistent as well, in my opinion. But just the way that she got it was... I mean, yeah, fine. So the last 2 of the main characters are Cersei and Jaime, and they got similar treatment in this season. First of all, Cersei had pretty much nothing to do. I thought at the very least, we would see that she had planned to plant the wildfire throughout King's Landing. At least that. But no, that was just from the Mad King's reign. So she just stood there in the Red Keep, so sure of her security, that she didn't even have measures in place in order to protect herself and her unborn child. Just in case the mad Dragon Queen came and actually took over, she didn't have any plan B, which is so unlike the character that we've come to know these past several seasons. But hey, whatever. She just stood there and watched horrified as Daenerys burned down her entire city. I think Lena Headey did a really good job. I mean, she's always doing a really good job, but they did not give her much to do in this season at all, and it's very disappointing because she was one of the most amazing characters of the show. To give her such a send-off was just... it was abominable. She didn't even have a confrontation with Sansa or Arya. Nothing like that at all. Like, none of her storylines were really wrapped up apart from her and Jaime, and we'll talk about Jaime in a second, but I just think it just does a disservice to the character. And anyway, fine, whatever. Again, fine. And now let's talk about Jaime. So they made a huge deal, the fact that Jaime left King's Landing, left his sister who was pregnant with his child, in order to go to the north and fight on behalf of the 7 kingdoms, because he knew that Cersei would not be giving any help to the north at all against the Night King. So he wanted to be there and do the right thing. And then of course he finds Brienne there and he knights her in this really touching moment that was just so beautifully done. And then he sleeps with her, kind of just ruining, in my opinion, that touching moment. The fact that Brienne, this hard and powerful and stoic character, was so emotional during that knighting sequence, it had so much more meaning. It was very powerful. But then they kind of undid that by showing just how heartbroken she was when Jaime left. I don't think it was necessary to give us that moment. It was such a fanficky moment where they slept together and then he ultimately, just as quickly as they were together, broke up the relationship. There was so many steps missing in that sequence of events because we only see them sleeping together and it never felt very genuine. He even says as it's happening that he's going to need more alcohol to get through it. Like, it's such a mess, and it makes it so hard to root for them because it wasn't carried out properly, and so that when it dissolved, it didn't have the impact that we were looking for, because it wasn't a satisfying relationship to begin with. And also when it dissolved, it felt like it came out of nowhere. Like, what was his thought process when he finally decided that Cersei was it for him? I think it just did a disservice to his character arc. I understand that there's this underlying reasoning of humans are inherently flawed, and sometimes people never change, no matter who tries to get through to them, no matter what happens to them. Sometimes it's just in them and it can't be removed. I get that 100%. But then why bother having Jaime go to the North in the first place? He barely had a significant scene during the Battle of Winterfell, only for him to come down straight after the Battle of Winterfell and hold Cersei in his arms as they both died. Like, that was pretty much it. That's all he did this season. Oh, apart from staring at Bran as well, that was also a significant part. Oh, and when he went through that trial that only lasted for 5 minutes, the character was just done dirty in this season, in my opinion. I wasn't a huge fan of the way that he was written. And whilst he had some touching moments with Tyrion, it just didn't make up for the fact that the character, he went awry. Whilst he may have died in Cersei's arms this season, I think he died way before then, when the writers just didn't know what to do with him. Speaking of Brienne, I already talked about how when she was knighted, it was such a powerful moment. I wasn't a huge fan of when she ended up losing her virginity to Jaime, only to be betrayed mere seconds after, apparently. But I liked the fact that she did end up telling Jaime's story in the book, in the last episode. I really liked that. There are some really funny memes online about what she was actually writing in that book, but I do like the sentiment of her being the bigger person, literally and also figuratively, and just wanting the best for this man that she ultimately really loved and cared for deeply. And she saw him for someone that no one else saw him as, which is just a true warrior. Someone who in her eyes did not deserve to be slapped with the name of Kingslayer for the rest of his life. Especially considering the king was just, like, the Mad King was awful. He was the worst. He was doing everyone a favour. Anyways, so I feel like that was a nice kind of ending to her story. Except I would have loved to see her turn a new page and start her own story. Like, I kind of expected that to happen because she's the first female knight. But I guess she's too humble of a character. Maybe Podrick will write it in for her in song lyrics or something. Speaking of Podrick, he's a knight too. That didn't really have a huge impact on me. It kind of happened off screen and it's just mentioned as a tongue-in-cheek gesture. Yeah, that happened. Moving on, and then you have Bronn. Now I'm going to put Bronn in with everyone in that small council that Tyrion has formed under King Bran the Broken. I just don't understand how that small council works. Like, what are Benioff and Weiss trying to tell us there? Because you have Sam, who makes sense. He's an intellectual person, although I don't see the point of Sam and Bran being there because they kind of cancel each other out in certain ways. But you have him there, fine, that makes sense. You have Brienne there, who also makes sense. Bronn frustrates me because on the one hand, it could be a clever commentary on the people who end up in power, basically doing so out of just favors or because they have money or because of their position, not necessarily because of their talents or their qualifications towards that position. So fine on the one hand. On the other hand, it's so frustrating because they really lay it on thick and he is preoccupied with the brothels instead of rebuilding houses and boats and re-establishing society in King's Landing after the disaster that was Dany's rampant rage on them. That's really frustrating to me. It was disappointing to see him there. He's just annoying. He was a really cool tongue-in-cheek character beforehand. I kind of liked him on the same level as the Hound, where they were fun sometimes when they were there. Sometimes I just wanted to skip along and get to the better characters. But in this season, he was pretty much useless. That scene where he comes to Winterfell all of a sudden and threatens the two brothers, I thought was just so it was just so out of nowhere, so unsatisfying. And he makes that speech about how it's the violent people who end up on the top, and I thought at least that would play an important role in the series at the end, but no, all that is established is that he's now the Lord of Highgarden, and I don't think it was necessary to bring him back at all during this season. We could have just forgotten about him and let him get on with his prostitutes and fun times. And then just touching upon the council in general, I feel like it was hilarious that the show basically showed us what King Bran's reign is going to look like. It's basically just going to be Tyrion ultimately running the show, being the puppeteer behind the king, while Bran's in a corner somewhere warging into a dragon or whatever. He barely lasted 2 seconds in that meeting and he was off. Like, I'm gonna go find the dragon because that's way more interesting to me than anything that you guys are discussing right now. At least the other potential rulers were interested in the people, like somewhat at the very least. Jon, Daenerys, like they had genuine interest in the fates of their people. Bran is... Now that I talked about the story elements that I did or didn't disagree with, I just have to say that overall, this is one of the best shows ever to have aired. The quality found in this show is like none other. Whilst for the past few seasons we as fans have grown frustrated with some of the story elements and the writing in the show, and we have said continually that the fact that Benioff and Weiss no longer have the books to kind of go off on has deteriorated the writing. I would say that, one, we don't really know for sure what the impact of that was on the writing. We can sit here and speculate from a distance, but we don't actually know what's going on in the writers' rooms, and we don't actually know what's going on with the correspondence between Benioff and Weiss and George R.R. Martin. So that complaint may just be over-exaggerated to some extent. And I think it shouldn't completely take away from the fact that this show truly is spectacular and one of the best TV show that I've ever watched. Having said that, it's the fact that they built such a huge, beautiful, intricate, intelligent world. And for the first several seasons, it was just a thing of beauty watching every single one of these episodes. From the story to the characterizations, the performances, the music, everything was there. For it to end like this, I think just makes it all the more disappointing. Whilst in the standards of other TV shows, this season was phenomenal, like out of this world. This is a good season for some shows. For Game of Thrones standards, I think it's fair to say that it doesn't quite match up. And I think therein lies the issue. We can't really compare it to an Arrowverse CW TV show. We can only compare it to the other seasons of Game of Thrones, and they were so much better. And I think what ultimately caused Game of Thrones to stumble was the limited time. I think a lot of the storytelling was rushed, and the developments, the character developments that they wanted to convey on screen didn't feel very earned at the end because of the rush. And secondly, I think the show became obsessed with subverting expectations because that's what Game of Thrones does, but Game of Thrones doesn't subvert expectations for the sake of it. This show has always earned that shock and awe because events like Ned Stark's death and the Red Wedding, whilst they were surprising to us and just blew our minds when they happened, they came from somewhere. There were actions that were committed and those actions had consequences. And we had thought that our favourite characters had escaped those consequences, but in actual fact, they had not. So when the events happened, we were surprised and we were shocked, but when we think about it, when you look back, it's like, oh yeah, this was kind of being alluded to and this was definitely a possibility that would have happened. The shock and awe that we've been seeing in the last season, it was just manufactured out of nowhere. The idea that Bran would become king, whilst that, again, that may be leading to that in the books, and George R.R. Martin may have told them that this is how it's going to end, but it didn't make sense in the context of the series because the only hint that we got to that was Tyrion talking to Bran off screen about the many adventures of the Three-Eyed Raven. That was nowhere near sufficient in order to establish that Bran has this amazing story that Tyrion would know about. Whereas Sansa's story, Arya's story, that's something that they definitely could have connected to and latched onto as an explanation for their ascent. So it made no sense. It felt like it was shocking for the sake of being shocking, and it left viewers feeling very empty, at least for me. And so for that reason, I would give season 8 of Game of Thrones a 6.5 out of 10. Most of that rating comes from the performances, the cinematography, music, costuming, set design, just all of the other technical aspects of Game of Thrones that have remained very consistent throughout the seasons. But just in terms of the story itself, I really wasn't a huge fan. But will that affect my opinion of this series as a whole? Well, considering that this is the very last season of Game of Thrones, I'm going to actually give the whole show a rating. And I would say that whilst this season has been disappointing, I don't want to take away too much from the rest of the show because it's just truly spectacular. So I would give Game of Thrones as a whole an 8.5 out of 10. So now that I told you guys what my thoughts were on Game of Thrones Season 8, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of the series down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe. The summer movie season is coming up and it's keeping me busy, so there'll be lots of videos coming up. But thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!